was a far better wake-up tool than any coffee he'd ever tried, but he'd still be hitting the black stuff all the same. Over the past few weeks, his sleep had been worse than at any point he could remember, so even reaching a functioning state would be a bonus. Functioning was as good as it got. Ever since his team's recent investigation into local organised crime, life and work had become purely functional. His world had been ripped apart by the revelation that Frank Vine, one of his longest-serving colleagues and a distinguished detective sergeant, had been feeding information to Gary McCann, a local criminal and Jack's arch-nemesis since becoming a detective. Not only had Frank been feeding operational information to McCann, but he'd actively been losing evidence and information in an attempt to ensure McCann got off scot-free. And it had worked. Jack had never quite understood how Gary McCann always managed to wriggle through the claws of justice, but the revelation of Frank's involvement had caused a few pennies to drop. Frank had never explicitly stated how long he'd been working for McCann, but Jack had his suspicions. For Frank, there was no way out of this. His involvement had been clear, even if they were still unable to prove McCann's guilt. That was the most frustrating aspect for Jack in trying to nail his nemesis over the years, the way in which McCann managed to keep himself one step removed from any action, making it almost impossible to prove his involvement at any point. He had enough of a hold over his minions that plenty were willing to take the rap for him, and he paid handsomely for it. There'd even been rumours of those who'd refused suddenly finding themselves disappeared, but yet again, evidence was thin on the ground, to say the least. But perhaps the most frustrating aspect for Jack was that Frank had clammed up, completely unwilling to talk or throw McCann under the bus. Despite having spent his whole career getting criminals locked up, Frank seemed hell-bent on ruining his entire life's work by refusing to testify. Jack could see the logic. What was the point in Frank risking having his family harmed in return for a lesser sentence? He'd still be going to prison, and in any case, his career and reputation had been ruined. With retirement around the corner and his health failing, there was a half-decent chance prison would finish him off either way, so it was understandable that he'd want to protect his family. But that wasn't enough for Jack. To him, it was simple. If McCann was locked up, Frank's family would be safe anyway, as would everyone else in and around Mildenheath. They'd spent years trying to bring McCann to justice, only to be thwarted at every opportunity. Now, finally, they had their chance to nail him, and it was one of his own detectives who held the key. However, with Frank having swallowed that metaphorical key, followed by a lifetime supply of metaphorical Imodium, it was now as good as useless. To Jack, it was clear that McCann's grubby tentacles reached further than he could ever have imagined, and he felt more determined than ever to make sure the bastard rotted in a prison cell for the rest of his life. That determination, though, for now, was buried below a well of despair and utter despondency at recent events. Jack and the rest of the team at Mildenheath Police had faced the ultimate betrayal, and it was one they wouldn't recover from anytime soon. It had been a mild consolation to discover that McCann's wife Imogen had left him and moved abroad with the gardener, but it wasn't enough for Jack. Besides which, there were still heavy rumours that McCann had been responsible for the disappearance and death of his first wife years earlier. Chrissy padded silently into the kitchen in her dressing gown and slippers. She'd been spending much more time at Jack's, and it was an unspoken truth that they were gradually heading towards her moving in permanently. Their own relationship had been tricky, not through any sort of incompatibility, but sheer circumstance. Although Jack's daughter Emily claimed she was fine with her dad dating her head teacher, he also knew Emily took after him in managing to hide things. One thing she hadn't managed to hide, though, was her pregnancy. "What's on your mind?" Chrissy asked, her voice almost a whisper, yet still making Jack jump. "Nothing. Just looking at the garden." "You can't stand gardens. That's your I'm looking out of the window and thinking pose."